I've got roughly 1,000 miles on this Kart water pump now, and it's starting to lose water. I'll be able to show you better once I get this pulley off, but there's a bunch of crud around the bearing and seal area there from it losing coolant. And I've also got more play in the impeller shaft than I've ever had before. So it looks like it's time for a rebuild. This water pump is a Righetti Ridolfi K514, and the rebuild kit for it is K514K. That has the bearings and seal and O-ring, and the impeller shaft is K514G. There are multiple Kart water pumps that use a fairly similar design to this, so the rebuild process should also be pretty similar. I'm going to begin by removing the water pump drive pulley. In my case, I've got 2 set screws, so I'm going to remove those, and then hopefully it will pull off of there. Some of these have bolt-on pulleys, so you'll have a nut on the end or a bolt on the end. Also, if you have set screws in there and you have used some kind of thread locker and they're exceptionally tight, you can't get them loose, then you may need to apply heat to the area before you try to remove them. And the reason I say to remove these instead of loosen them is because some of the water pump designs will actually have where the set screw goes in through the impeller shaft, so you just want to make sure that it's totally out of there and that won't hold it up when you try to remove the pulley. Okay, this one's pretty snug. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to get this off by hand. Doesn't look like it. There are multiple ways that you could go about doing this. I'm going to try a pulley or a gear puller. You could also just try to heat the pulley, especially when you've got an aluminum pulley on a steel shaft. If you heat the aluminum, it should expand more than the steel will, and then hopefully it will remove easily. You can also use a combination of these. If your puller isn't working very well, you can heat the pulley as well and use the puller, and that should make it come off easier. Just make sure to use the proper heat-resistant gloves if you're going to work with heat. Now that the pulley's off, you can see all of the crud that I was talking about because the coolant has been seeping out of this area. Now I'm going to remove the circlip on the impeller shaft with a pair of circlip pliers. If there was a washer behind the circlip, you can remove that now as well. Next, I'm going to remove the 3 bolts and nuts that hold the flange together. And then the flange should just pop off. Now you can remove the O-ring that goes around the flange. Next, I need to get the impeller out of there. If yours is really worn, perhaps it will just slide out. That's not usually going to happen. What I'm going to do is take a brass hammer and tap the end of the impeller shaft and try to get it out that way. You could also press that out. Now the bearings and the seal are going to have to come out of here. Before I do that, you can really tell how bad this was when I just tried to spin the bearing with nothing in there. A lot of play in there, makes a lot of noise. I'm going to try to use a punch with a flat end to drive this bearing out first. So I'm going to go in through the back, and even though these bearings are the same size, if you go in at an angle, you can catch the edge, the back edge of this bearing. So catch that edge and keep the punch at an angle, and then try to tap that out of there, or drive that out of there. So now I can clearly see that bearing, so I've switched to a larger flat punch, and I'm going to try and drive the bearing and the seal out at the same time. Once you've got everything out of there, it's a good idea to make sure your replacement parts match up to the parts that came out of it. If you've got something like mine where you can get a kit directly from the manufacturer, you should be fine, but it never hurts to check. Now I'm going to clean up both parts of the housing, the pulley, as well as the hardware that I'll be reusing. Now I'm going to reinstall the bearings. I've made sure those are clean as well, and I'm going to start with the one on this end. So I'm going to put it in place. I will say I do have a press. I could do this that way, but for the benefit of everyone that doesn't have a press, I'll just go ahead and drive them in. Again, with this, if you'd like to, you can heat the housing, and it may make the bearings go in a little bit easier. I'm going to start off with a chunk of wood, set that over top of there, and start to tap this down into place. I'm going to look at the other side. I can see that the bearing is all the way up against that lip in there, so that's as far as it can go. If you need to drive this a little bit deeper, you can use an impact socket. You want something that closely matches the outside diameter of the bearing, but is just a little bit smaller because you don't want it to touch the walls. Whenever you're driving a bearing in like this, you want to put all the pressure on the outer race there. Now I'm going to install the bearing on this side, so I'll start by just dropping this into place and sort of pushing it down so it sits kind of flat. You'll notice I'm setting the pump on this chunk of wood just to make sure I don't damage the housing or the new bearing that I just installed. Then I'm going to take my impact socket, line that up with the bearing, and then begin to drive this in. You should be able to feel when it's bottomed out, but again, you can take a look down inside there and make sure the bearing is right up against that ridge. Next, I want to install the seal, and it's going to face this way, but before it goes in, I'm just going to go ahead and put a little bit of grease on the inside lip there. Now I can set that down into place. Again, try to press it down a bit by hand. This time around, instead of the impact socket, I'm going to use a bearing and seal driver. You don't really have to have a bearing and seal driver, but something nice and flat that will fit inside of here and make good contact all the way around the outside of the seal. That should end up sitting basically flush with this surface, and then if you look in there, you should see that it is right up against that last bearing that you pressed in. Next, I want to install the new impeller shaft. So just start by trying to push that down through the seal. You're probably not going to get it to just press through the bearing, so you may have to either tap or press that through. Since this is a new impeller, I don't want to damage it. I'm going to put a chunk of wood on here and tap it gently to see if I can get it to start going through there. There it goes. Okay, see if we can get it the rest of the way through. You can see that I've got a very tight fit of the impeller and the bearing. I've actually pushed this bearing out of the housing a little bit when I was trying to tap the impeller in. So I'm going to go back to using my impact socket. That way I can now set this upside down that way. The shaft can travel through the center, and when I tap this down, it should try to bring everything together. it, I'm going to use a brass punch right here in the center, just to try and get that last little bit. There we go. Now the impeller is installed deep enough that it sits below this surface, and I can also see the entire circlip groove on this side. So I'm going to go ahead and drop my washer back into place on there, and then I can try to get the circlip reinstalled into that ring. And now everything is very tight. There's actually no play in this shaft. I am kind of worried that it could begin to move the bearings if there were an issue, but if that happens, I could always kind of redo this job and add some retaining compound around the bearing, or perhaps just replace the pump at that point. It may be advisable to measure the inside diameter of the pump housing and just make sure that hasn't worn to be so large that the bearing can't fit in there properly. But for me, I'm going to call this part of it done. Now I can move on to putting my O-ring in place and then refitting the rear section of the housing. There are a couple ways you can go about installing the new O-ring. You could set it down into the rear housing, into the kind of groove for it there, and then carefully install the rear cover. The way I would prefer is just to set it around this raised section on the rear cover or the rear housing, and then carefully put those two pieces together. Then you'll just have to align your bolt holes and install the nuts and bolts. With this particular housing, it's very easy because the nuts have these sections that they can drop into, so you don't even have to hold them with a wrench. Just kind of keep pressure on everything and start installing your bolts. I don't have a torque spec, but these are small fasteners, so basically I just go around and snug them all up and then give them a small part of another turn. And that should be good. Now with that installed, I'm going to go ahead and just make sure my impeller still turns freely, which it does. The last part of the job is reinstall the drive pulley and tighten that down. Now make sure you pay attention to your impeller shaft, because many of them have an indentation in there where the set screw can go. Some of them even have threads in there, so the set screw goes all the way through the shaft. So if that's the case and you're using set screws, you want to make sure you align one of the set screw holes up with the divot or whatever, the indentation in that shaft. You're going to get the block of wood out once again and try to gently tap this down into place. And I just want to go until the end of that shaft is flush with the end of this pulley. To finish up, I just need to reinstall my set screws into the pulley, and I'm going to use a little bit of medium strength thread locker when I do that. Again, I'm not going to use any torque spec for these, just going to get them snug. Hopefully at this point you've got a nice freshly rebuilt water pump that operates smoothly and quietly and leak-free. If this video has been helpful to you, please give it a like and don't forget to subscribe for more. Thanks for watching.